The city was burning. Captain Marcus Diaz watched from the rooftop of the SWAT headquarters as columns of smoke rose into the night sky, lit from below by the flames devouring everything in their path. The alien ships hung overhead like dark omens, massive, insect-like crafts blotting out the stars. Diaz's grip tightened around the binoculars as he scanned the chaos below. Screams echoed through the streets, mingling with the guttural roars of the Israq warriors, hulking, armored figures who moved with a terrifying purpose through the wreckage. "Diaz, we need to move!" Officer Sarah Green's voice cut through the crackling of the radio. Her tone was steady, but he caught the edge of urgency underneath. He turned away from the destruction meeting her eyes. Sarah stood a few feet behind him, her face smeared with dirt and sweat, her rifle slung across her back. She had been with him through the worst of it, the battles overseas, the riots back home, and there was no one he trusted more in this moment. "Just a few more seconds," Diaz replied, his voice calm. He scanned the horizon, noting the Israq's advance. They were pushing deeper into the city, converging on the financial district. "They're heading for Sector 7. We need to cut them off before they reach the central hub." Sarah nodded, understanding his unspoken command. "We're splitting up, then?" "Yeah. You take Bravo and hit them from the north. We'll come in from the south and squeeze them in the middle." "Copy that," she said, already turning to relay the orders. Diaz watched her go, her silhouette framed against the fiery backdrop. His mind raced through the plan, calculating risks and contingencies. The Israq were brutal and relentless, but they weren't invincible. Not if he could keep his team together, use the city against them. He descended the stairs two at a time, rejoining the rest of his unit in the armory. The tension was palpable as they loaded weapons, checked equipment, and shared terse, focused glances. Sergeant Kyle Harlow, their explosives expert, handed Diaz a bag of C4 charges, his expression grim. "Gonna be a hell of a night, Cap," Harlow muttered. "We're sitting ducks out there." Diaz clapped him on the shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "We're not sitting. We're hunting. Keep your head in the game." Harlow nodded, swallowing his fear. Diaz turned to the rest of the team, his gaze sweeping over each member. They were a seasoned group, tough, resilient, battle-hardened. But tonight was different. They weren't just facing armed criminals or terrorist cells. They were up against an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. "Listen up," Diaz began, his voice steady, commanding. "The Israq think they can roll over us. They think we're weak, disorganized. Let's show them what a mistake that is. We've got the home field advantage. We know these streets better than they ever will. Use it. Move fast, hit hard, and watch each other's backs." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone out there who can't. Let's make them regret ever setting foot in this city." A chorus of affirmations followed, the team's resolve hardening. Diaz felt a surge of pride and determination. They might be outnumbered, outgunned, but they were not outmatched. "All right, move out," Diaz ordered, and they scattered, each member falling into their roles with practiced efficiency. He led Alpha Team down to the street, the sounds of battle growing louder as they moved through the shadowed alleys and deserted storefronts. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. Diaz's heart pounded as they neared their destination, the sounds of gunfire and explosions reverberating through the narrow streets. They reached the southern edge of the financial district, crouching behind the remains of a toppled bus. He glanced at his watch. Sarah's team should be in position. He keyed his radio. "Bravo, this is Alpha. Status? Bravo in position." Sarah's voice crackled back. "We've got eyes on their advance units. It's a big push, Marcus. Looks like they're bringing in one of those war machines." Diaz cursed under his breath. The Israq war machines were towering monstrosities, bristling with weapons and nearly impervious to conventional firepower. They need to be creative to take it down. He looked at Harlow. "Think you can set a trap?" Harlow's eyes gleamed with grim determination. "Just point me to where you want it." Diaz nodded, outlining the plan quickly. Harlow and two others broke off, moving silently through the rubble to set the charges. The rest of the team hunkered down, weapons trained on the intersection ahead. Minutes passed, the tension building. The ground vibrated slightly, and then the ISRAC appeared, a line of massive, armored figures marching down the avenue, their war machine lumbering behind them. The beast's legs crushed vehicles beneath it, its cannons scanning for targets. Diaz signaled for his team to hold fire, watching as the aliens drew closer. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They needed to time this perfectly. The first rank of ISRAC soldiers passed the hidden charges, oblivious. Diaz waited, breath held, until the war machine was directly over them. "Now!" he shouted. The night exploded in a blinding flash as the C4 detonated. The war machine reeled, one of its legs blown clean off, sending it crashing to the ground. The ISRAC forces scattered, disoriented by the sudden attack. Diaz's team opened fire, picking off the aliens as they scrambled for cover. But as the dust settled, a shadow loomed behind the downed machine. Another war machine, larger and more heavily armed, stepped into view, its cannons locking onto Diaz's position. He froze, his mind racing. They had played right into the ISRAC's hands. The second machine's cannons began to glow, charging up. Diaz's heart thundered in his chest as he screamed into the radio. "Bravo, fall back! It's a trap!" The roar of the war machine's cannons drowned out his words as the world around him erupted in blinding light. Gunfire erupted as the SWAT team scrambled for cover. The war machine loomed above, its cannons unleashing beams of searing energy that ripped through concrete and steel. Captain Marcus Diaz clenched his teeth, feeling the ground tremble beneath his feet as he crouched behind the remains of a shattered wall. His heart pounded with the realization that they were trapped, hemmed in by the relentless onslaught. "Damn it, they've got us pinned!" Officer Sarah Green's voice crackled through the radio, frustration laced with fear. She was hunkered down with her team across the intersection, the ISRAC's heavy infantry closing in from all sides. Diaz risked a glance over the edge of the wall. The alien soldiers advanced with cold precision, their armor gleaming under the flickering streetlights. He counted at least a dozen, their weapons aimed and ready. And beyond them, the war machine, a towering beast of metal and death, held its position, cannons still trained on the scattered SWAT team. "We need to draw their fire away from the others," Diaz said, his mind racing. "Sarah, can you get to higher ground?" "Not without getting fried," she shot back, her voice tight. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they cut us off completely." Diaz scanned the area, looking for anything that could give them an edge. His eyes locked onto a narrow alleyway about 50 feet to his left, barely visible through the smoke and debris. It led to a cluster of old buildings, places he knew well from his years patrolling the city. If they could get there, they'd have a chance to regroup, maybe even counterattack. "We're falling back to the alley," he barked into the radio. "On my mark, move fast and cover each other." A chorus of acknowledgments crackled back, the team steeling themselves for the dash. Diaz took a deep breath, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He signaled to Harlow, who had taken cover nearby, gripping his rifle tightly. "Harlow, we're gonna need a distraction," Diaz said. "You think you can give us some fireworks?" Harlow's face, streaked with sweat and dirt, broke into a grim smile. "I've got just the thing, Cap." As Harlow reached into his pack, Diaz counted down silently. 3, 2, 1. "Now!" Diaz shouted. Harlow popped up, hurling a grenade toward the war machine. It exploded in a burst of light and smoke, momentarily blinding the alien gunners. The ISRAC hesitated, their movements faltering just long enough for Diaz and his team to sprint toward the alley. Bullets and energy blasts zipped past them, tearing chunks out of the asphalt. Diaz pushed forward, his legs burning as he covered the distance. He could hear Jenkins behind him, grunting with effort, and Sarah's voice urging her team to move. They reached the alley, slamming into the narrow corridor just as the war machine's cannons roared again. The blast obliterated the spot where they had been standing moments before, a shockwave of heat and force rolling over them. Diaz staggered, his ears ringing, but he kept moving, dragging Jenkins with him. Keep going! He yelled, his voice raw. Don't stop! They sprinted deeper into the alley, weaving through the twisted maze of buildings. The sounds of the battle faded slightly, replaced by the echoing clatter of their footsteps and the distant rumble of collapsing structures. Diaz slowed, glancing back to make sure everyone was accounted for. Sarah and her team emerged behind them, panting and battered but alive. Harlow brought up the rear, his face pale but determined. We made it! Sarah gasped, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. But for how long? Diaz nodded, his mind already churning through their next steps. We need to get higher. Find a vantage point. If we can see their command signals, we can figure out where their leaders are hiding. Yeah, but how do we get up there without getting blasted to pieces? Jenkins asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Diaz looked around, his eyes settling on a fire escape that clung to the side of a nearby building like a rusted skeleton. It led to the roof, a precarious route, but their best shot. There! He pointed. We go up and spread out. Use the rooftops to move. It'll be risky, but it's better than getting pinned down here. Sarah followed his gaze, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. You really think we can pull this off, Marcus? He met her gaze, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. We don't have a choice. It's this or we let them keep pushing us back until there's nowhere left to run. A beat of silence, then Sarah nodded, determination settling over her features. All right. Let's move. One by one, they climbed the fire escape, the metal creaking ominously beneath their weight. Diaz was the last to ascend, his senses on high alert for any sign of pursuit. They reached the rooftop, crouching low as they surveyed the city below. The view was staggering, a panorama of devastation. Fires burned unchecked, plumes of smoke rising into the night sky. The streets were a twisted nightmare of wreckage and corpses, both human and alien. In the distance, the Iraq war machine stalked through the rubble, its cannons lighting up the darkness with deadly bursts of energy. Diaz's heart sank as he realized how precarious their situation was. The Iraq weren't just attacking randomly. They were systematically dismantling the city's defenses, sweeping through with ruthless efficiency. This isn't just an invasion, he murmured. It's extermination. Sarah's expression hardened as she watched the destruction. Then we hit them where it hurts. Make them bleed for every inch they take. Diaz nodded, a grim resolve settling over him. We'll have to move fast. Harlow, Jenkins, set up overwatch here. Keep an eye on their movements and relay any patterns you see. Sarah, you're with me. We're going to find their command node and disrupt their signals. Understood, Harlow said, his eyes scanning the skyline. We'll give you a clear path if we see any gaps. Diaz and Sarah crept along the rooftop, staying low to avoid drawing attention. The buildings here were tightly packed, the narrow gaps between them easy to traverse with a bit of nerve and balance. They moved like shadows, slipping from one rooftop to the next, the sounds of the battle below a constant reminder of the stakes. As they neared the center of the district, Diaz paused, peering over the edge of a crumbling ledge. His breath caught in his throat. There, in the heart of the city, stood a massive Iraq command post. It bristled with alien technology, pulsating with a sickly green light. Hundreds of Iraq soldiers guarded it, and at its core, a towering figure clad in ornate armor directed the assault. Looks like we found the boss, Sarah whispered, her eyes narrowing. How the hell do we get close to that? Diaz's mind raced, calculating their options. They couldn't hope to take the command post head-on, not with their limited resources. But if they could create a diversion, something big enough to draw the Iraq's attention. We're going to need a distraction, he said, his voice low and tense. Something big enough to make them pull troops from the post. Sarah's gaze flicked to the war machine prowling the nearby streets. That thing's been on us since the start. What if we lead it right into their backyard? Diaz considered it, the plan forming quickly. It's risky, but it might just work. We draw the war machine to the post, let it tear through their ranks. That'll give us the window we need to get inside. The instant Diaz saw the Iraq soldiers scaling the roof, instinct took over. He swung his rifle up, firing a burst of shots that scattered the first two aliens back down the ledge. They tumbled, screeching, their limbs flailing as they hit the ground below. But more were climbing, their clawed hands gripping the edge with terrifying speed. "Sarah, move!" Diaz shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Sarah whipped around, her pistol already drawn. She fired with lethal precision, each shot landing between the aliens' segmented armor plates. One dropped, then another, but there were too many. Their guttural roars echoed across the rooftop, a chilling reminder of just how far outnumbered they were. "We can't hold them here," Sarah yelled, glancing at Diaz as she reloaded. "We need to get to the war machine now." Diaz's mind raced. They couldn't abandon their plan. Drawing the war machine into the Israq command post was their only chance to disrupt the enemy's control. But getting there with these soldiers on their tail? It was a suicide run. "Follow me!" he barked, charging forward. He veered away from the approaching aliens, his boots thudding against the rooftop as he headed for the narrow gap between two buildings. Without hesitation, he leapt, his body sailing over the void. He landed hard, the impact jarring his bones, but he didn't stop. He turned, extending a hand as Sarah made the jump, her form a blur of movement. They hit the ground running, weaving between ventilation units and antennae, the alien soldiers swarming behind them. Diaz risked a glance back and saw one of the Israq raise a device to its mouth. A shrill, piercing sound erupted, followed by an ominous whirring noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell is that?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Diaz didn't need to ask. He knew. The war machine was responding to the signal, its massive frame turning in their direction. They were no longer just a nuisance, they were targets. He pushed harder, adrenaline coursing through his veins. They skidded to a stop at the edge of the building. Below them, a narrow alley stretched, filled with the detritus of a once thriving city. The war machine loomed at the far end, its cannons glowing ominously as it turned its attention to the roof. "Down there!" Diaz shouted, pointing to a crumbling fire escape. They scrambled down, metal rattling under their weight. Halfway down, a burst of plasma seared overhead, melting the top of the structure into a twisted mass. They jumped the last few feet, landing awkwardly but uninjured. The war machine's cannons shifted, adjusting their aim. Diaz grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her into the alley as another blast obliterated the fire escape above them. Dust and debris rained down, stinging their skin. "We're not gonna outrun that thing," Sarah panted, her eyes darting around wildly. "What's the plan?" Diaz's mind spun, calculating, assessing. They were boxed in, and the war machine was too powerful to take down head-on. But then his gaze landed on the debris scattered along the alley, a tangle of broken pipes, shattered glass, and nestled among the wreckage, a small but unmistakable metal cylinder. A gas line, ruptured and leaking. An idea formed, reckless and desperate. He looked at Sarah, his expression fierce. "We're gonna blow it. Use the explosion to get clear and hope it distracts the machine long enough to move." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's insane. If that thing blows while we're still here, we'll be ash," Diaz finished, his voice steady. "But if we stay here, we're already dead." She hesitated only a second before nodding. "All right. Let's do it." Diaz pulled a small incendiary device from his pack, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He set it near the leaking gas line, his pulse thundering in his ears. "As soon as this goes off, we move. No looking back." Sarah nodded, her grip tight on her weapon. They backed up, pressing themselves against the rough brick wall of the alley. Diaz's hand hovered over the detonator, every nerve in his body screaming with anticipation. He pressed the button. The explosion was deafening, a blast of heat and force that slammed into them like a tidal wave. Diaz felt himself lifted off his feet, the world spinning as he was thrown against the opposite wall. His vision blurred, pain lancing through his side. He hit the ground coughing, his ears ringing. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The air was thick with dust and smoke, his lungs burning with each gasp. He blinked, forcing his eyes to focus. The war machine was reeling, its sensors blinded by the sudden flare. Sparks flew from its joints, its movements jerky and disoriented. "Sarah!" he croaked, struggling to push himself up. "I'm here!" Her voice was a lifeline, cutting through the haze. She was on her feet, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, but otherwise unharmed. She pulled him up, her grip firm. They staggered forward, the war machine still thrashing behind them. Diaz glanced back, satisfaction flaring in his chest as he saw the Iraq soldiers scattered by the blast, their advance halted. But the victory was fleeting. The war machine, though damaged, was recovering. Its cannons began to glow again, a deadly light building at their cores. "We need to move," Sarah urged, practically dragging him along. They stumbled out of the alley, into the street beyond. Ahead, Diaz saw their destination, the Iraq command post, its towering spire glowing with an eerie, pulsating light. But between them and their goal lay a stretch of open ground, littered with debris and crawling with Iraq troops. His heart sank. They had made it this far, only to face another insurmountable obstacle. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the edge of the command post, near the base of the spire, a group of Iraq stood in a tight circle. They were guarding something, or someone. Diaz squinted, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It was a human. Bound and battered, their head hanging low. A prisoner. Diaz's heart clenched. He didn't know who they were, but they were alive, and the Iraq had them. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice was filled with dread. "We can't leave them." Diaz knew what she was asking. Knew what it would cost. Every fiber of his being screamed against it. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and the war machine was still on their tail. Trying to rescue the prisoner was suicide. But he also knew he couldn't turn away. Not now. Not after everything. "Get to the command post," he said, his voice rough. "I'll get them out." Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce. "I'm not leaving you. We do this together, or not at all." For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, the world collapsing around them. Then Diaz nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "All right," he said softly. Together. They moved, their bodies low, hearts pounding, every sense stretched taut. The war machine was almost on them, its shadow stretching long across the ground. Diaz glanced up at the towering structure of the command post, his jaw set with determination. This was it. One chance to turn the tide. He didn't see the Iraq sniper on the rooftop above. Didn't notice the barrel aimed at his back. Not until it was too late. A single gunshot rang out, slicing through the chaos like a blade. Diaz's world tilted as pain exploded in his shoulder, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs, his vision dimming around the edges. His rifle clattered away, skidding across the debris-strewn street. He lay there for a second, stunned, trying to force air back into his body. "Marcus!" Sarah's scream cut through the haze. She dropped beside him, her hands pressing against the wound. Blood soaked through her fingers, warm and slick. He could see the fear in her eyes, a stark contrast to the determination etched on her face. She was saying something, her voice urgent, but he couldn't make out the words. Everything seemed distant, muffled. Diaz fought to clear his head, focusing on her face. "Sniper!" he managed to gasp, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to push himself up, but his body refused to cooperate. The pain was excruciating, radiating through his entire chest with every shallow breath. Sarah glanced up, her eyes scanning the rooftops. "I see him. Bastard's got a bead on us." Her voice was tight, controlled, but Diaz could see the tension in the set of her jaw. She shifted, trying to shield him with her body. "Stay down. I'll get you out of here." "No." Diaz gritted his teeth, forcing his voice to steady. "We can't, not now. Get the prisoner." Each word was a struggle, the effort draining what little strength he had left. "Not without you," she snapped, her gaze darting back to his. "We're not leaving you here." Diaz's mind swam, a fog of pain and exhaustion threatening to pull him under. He knew she meant it. Knew that Sarah would stay, would fight to the bitter end, no matter the cost. It was who she was, loyal, stubborn, unyielding. But they couldn't afford to lose this chance. Not now, when they were so close. "You have to," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. "Get the prisoner. That's an order." For a heartbeat, Sarah hesitated, her eyes searching his. Then, with a reluctant nod, she grabbed his sidearm from his holster, her movements swift and precise. "I'll be back. Don't you dare die on me, Marcus." Diaz managed a faint smile, the world around him blurring. "No promises." She squeezed his hand once, then rose, her silhouette sharp against the burning city. Diaz watched as she sprinted towards the command post, her figure a dark blur against the flames. Each step she took sent a jolt of fear through him, the knowledge that any moment she could be cut down by the sniper's fire. But she moved like a shadow, ducking and weaving through the chaos, and the sniper's shots went wide. He tried to lift his head, to follow her progress, but his strength failed him. The pain in his shoulder throbbed, hot and relentless, and his vision swam with black spots. He could hear the war machine's heavy footsteps growing closer, the ground trembling with each massive stride. It was searching, hunting, and it wouldn't take long to find him. A surge of frustration coursed through him, mingling with the pain. He had come so far, pushed himself beyond his limits, and now, at the critical moment, he was helpless. Useless. He clenched his fist, his nails biting into his palm. He had to get up. Had to move. But his body refused to obey, each attempt met with searing agony. "Damn it!" he muttered, his voice barely audible. He could feel the darkness pulling at him, the edges of his consciousness fraying. But he couldn't give in. Not yet. Not when everything was at stake. With a supreme effort, he dragged himself forward, inch by painful inch. His fingers scraped against the rough asphalt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, but he forced himself to keep going. He had to get to cover, had to buy Sarah time. His hand brushed against something cold and metallic. His rifle. Diaz closed his fingers around the grip, pulling it towards him. It felt impossibly heavy, but he gritted his teeth and managed to lift it, propping the barrel against the ground. His vision blurred, but he could make out the shadow of the war machine, its massive form looming just down the street. It was turning, its sensors sweeping the area, searching. He blinked, trying to focus. He had one shot, maybe two. He just needed to buy a few more seconds. Diaz braced himself, his finger tightening on the trigger. The war machine's head swiveled, its glowing eyes locking onto him. Diaz took a deep breath, steadying himself. He squeezed the trigger, sending a burst of gunfire at the machine's exposed joints. Sparks flew, the bullets ricocheting off its armor. It turned fully towards him, the cannons on its back beginning to charge. "Come on, you bastard!" Diaz muttered, his voice a strained whisper. He fired again, aiming for the same spot. A lucky shot, a glancing hit, and something inside the war machine sparked and flared. The machine paused, a shudder running through its massive frame. But it was still coming. Diaz could see the cannons glowing brighter, the energy building. He was out of time. He let the rifle slip from his grasp, his strength finally giving out. The world around him seemed to slow, each breath a struggle. And then, in the midst of the haze, he saw her. Sarah, running full tilt towards him, the prisoner slung over her shoulder. She moved like a force of nature, her face set in grim determination. Behind her, the Iraq forces were in disarray, scattered by the confusion of the sudden retreat. But the war machine hadn't noticed. Its focus was still on Diaz, its weapons locked on target. "Sarah, no!" Diaz tried to shout, but his voice was a feeble croak. He wanted to tell her to stop, to get out of the line of fire. But she kept coming, her feet pounding against the ground, her eyes fixed on him. He could see the war machine's cannons begin to glow, the energy crackling around them. His heart pounded, fear and helplessness clawing at his insides. There was no way she could reach him in time, no way to get clear before the machine fired. But she didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. And in that moment, Diaz saw something that made his blood run cold. The sniper. Perched high on a nearby building, the rifle aimed directly at Sarah's back. He tried to shout, to warn her, but the words stuck in his throat. His body wouldn't move, wouldn't obey. He could only watch, his heart hammering, as the sniper's finger tightened on the trigger. A flash of light, a single shot. Sarah stumbled, her legs faltering. But she didn't go down. She pushed forward, her face twisted in pain and determination, dragging the prisoner with her. "Come on," Diaz whispered, his voice breaking. "Come on, Sarah." The war machine's cannons flared, the energy reaching its peak. Diaz felt a surge of despair, knowing what was coming, knowing he couldn't stop it. He braced himself, every muscle tensed, waiting for the inevitable. But instead of firing, the war machine shuddered. Sparks erupted from its joints, its movements growing jerky and erratic. It took a step back, then another, the light in its eyes dimming. A guttural roar echoed from its speakers, a sound of confusion and pain. Diaz stared, disbelief warring with hope. Something was wrong. The machine was malfunctioning, its systems failing. He glanced back at Sarah, saw the fierce, determined look on her face as she ran, her steps faltering but unbroken.